Every so often, a brand new piece of camera gear gets announced that feels almost too good to be true. It has all the features you're looking for, it's from a reputable brand, and so you save up your money and you buy it because you just have to have it. But then after a few weeks or maybe months, you realize you don't really use it all that often. Well, the piece of gear I'm talking about today could not be further from that description because I use it on almost every single project, and I hate it. I'm not joking when I say I have never been so conflicted about a product I use constantly and that drives me crazy every time I use it. So that's the Moza slypod Pro. Well, actually, this here is the aircross 2 that you can see, but it's being pushed in by the slypod Pro. So beside me here, I have the aircross 2. It's just a kind of a generic gimbal sitting on top of the slypod Pro. And what the slypod Pro is basically just a motorized monopod. So it's got 3 little feet here, and using their app or some kind of janky buttons on the device, you can just make it go up or make it go back down. The slypod also has 2 mounting points, one down here at the bottom and one up here with a couple of 3/8 inch and some 1/4 inch mounting points. And then also the feet themselves are Arca-Swiss compatible. So you can just stick a lot of photographic tripod heads onto these or put in your own tripod plates, or you can thread a light stand into this, a friction arm. There's kind of a lot of ways you can mount the slypod horizontally, diagonally, vertically. That's all of the ways.
I think it's gonna be sick. It's gonna be sick. I hate that I have to come back up here. Take this all down.
I purchased the slypod on Kickstarter like a year ago. And then I purchased the gimbal like 6 months ago. And there's a funny story about the gimbal purchase, but I think we'll probably get into that later. If you were to go back and watch any of my YouTube videos as far back as probably September, August of 2021, I don't think you'd find a single video that didn't have at least 1, but probably 2 or 3 or 5 or 20 shots that were made using the slypod. Now, there have been significantly less shots made using the aircross 2 slypod combo, but that's for reasons we will also get into a little bit later. This is something I bought because I wanted it. I could have reached out, but I was like, blah, 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 blah. And so as I've been working on the script for this video, the main thing I've been trying to do is write down all the pros and cons, the things it's helped me do, the things I like, and the things that have been driving me crazy. Oh my God. Dave, I hate it. It just keeps disconnecting every time I try and start the shot. There have been a lot of cons and not that many pros, except somehow the pros have, at least for me, outweighed the cons. Keep this in mind while you're watching the video. When I seem excited, take it with a grain of salt. And when I seem upset, maybe take that part more seriously. The reason that I bought it was because I spend so much time making these videos by myself that I was just like tired of either having to ask someone to hold a camera for me or have pretty much all of my shots on a tripod locked off. And in that regard, I was right. I really have found it so helpful to be able to get just a little bit of motion in my time lapses. It's usually just kind of a push or a pull, maybe a little bit of a side-to-side motion. And then for the odd shot where I want it to feel like a little bit of a higher production value and I want the camera moving in real time, I can do that. In fact, this was the first shot I ever took when I got it, and I set it up, I got the shot, and I looked at it and I was like, perfect, great. Like, if that's all I can do with this thing, then to an extent, it was worth the money, because I've never been able to get shots like that. I've owned a handful of sliders over my career, and even with those, you can't really get such a nice clean push-in, certainly not on a 14mm lens, because, well, there's a track in front of it. So being able to just push with having nothing in the frame is fantastic. Gosh, I am really losing light here. And also have a burrito at home waiting for me. I'm gonna go eat that burrito and pick this up tomorrow, probably. Today's video is brought to you by the fine folks over at Storyblocks. Storyblocks is our go-to resource when it comes to everything high quality stock footage, sound effects, After Effects templates, graphic elements, all sorts of these kind of little bits and pieces that you're gonna need to spice your edits up. And with their very affordable, unlimited all-access plan, you get access to unlimited downloads from their demand-driven, royalty-free library. They currently have well over 1 million digital assets on their servers, and you get access to all of that, which means you've got over 1 million ways to improve your film. Right, buddy? So whether there's a shot that you weren't able to get, or maybe a shot you forgot to get and you just need to fill out that edit, go check out www.storyblocks.com/Jesse Driftwood to find out more. Also, there's a link in the description, so you don't have to type anything in. You can just click it. Thank you, Storyblocks. Thank you, people watching my movies. Hey. I found out that you can pair their gimbals, at least this one, the aircross 2, and I guess there's a newer one, the aircross 3, to the slypod, enabling more like a proper motion control system. I don't understand this gimbal. So you can set the in point of the slypod, the out point of the slypod, and the in and out points of the gimbal, giving you ability to have it slide and track with your subject. And when I first heard about this, I was like, that sounds great, seems easy, the gimbal's not that expensive, let's go for it. Now, Moza has also emailed me a bunch of times in the past, like asking me to review gear and things like that. And sometime around October, November, I had an email from them and I said, listen, I have the slypod already, I use it all the time, and I plan on making a video about it. If you want to send me the gimbal, I would love to play with some more motion control stuff. And for whatever reason, we just kept going back and forth. They were asking me what camera I was using. I was saying mostly the FX3, and they were like, well, the aircross 2 doesn't support that. And I was like, that's confusing because it supports the 5D Mark IV and the A7S Mark III. But still, for some reason, they were insisting that I should use other cameras. And I said, okay, fine. Sometimes we use our phone, sometimes we use all the other cameras at the studio. Just let's make this happen. I want to try the motion control stuff. And then they just responded being like, okay, what's your concept for a video? And I was like, all right, I'm done. I went on Amazon. It was like $300 or $400 next day delivery. So I ordered one and I replied, I bought the aircross 2. I hope you're happy. And have I been happy with it?
I hate this thing.
That's not the question. It's fine. It's a gimbal. Like, it doesn't seem to have any special features, but it works well enough. I've used it for the odd shot when it's just sitting around. And so on its own, the gimbal, yeah, it's fine. The slypod, yeah, it's fine. When you pair these things together to try and get those like really magical, like larger than life motion control shots like you saw at the beginning of this video, hopefully, that's when it all falls apart.
I hate this thing. And yet it's the only thing that I can do this kind of shot with. Well, not this kind of shot. Hopefully the shot that I used in the intro. But
there's just no way I'm about to figure this out right now. It's too hard. In fact, before we even talk about connecting them together and having things fall apart, the app does just kind of suck. It's very confusing, and there's no real explanation. I'm gonna pull it up here for a second so I don't misquote any of this. Here I am connected to the slypod. I basically just have this red bar. If I slide up, it goes up. Pretty simple. I'm in what's called regular mode. Then they have two other modes, gear shift mode and acceleration mode. No description of what those are. You kind of have to play with it. One of them seems to have like a bit of an ease on the start and stop, and one of them seems to ramp up all the way until the end. I'm guessing that one's acceleration mode. And then they have toggle switches like slow start and adsorption. I had no idea what adsorption was, so I Googled it. Turns out, it has nothing to do with this app. I don't know if this is a mistranslation of the word absorption, which I also don't know how it would fit here, but adsorption certainly has nothing to do with this slider. Another thing in the app I forgot to mention is that when you are setting the time it takes, it gives you these hours, minutes, and seconds dials to scroll through, except hours is just always stuck at 0, and minutes goes up to 30, but a lot of the time it'll say, well, this is too long. And so in this scenario, I had to go down to like 16 minutes before it said I could do that. So I don't get, why even give me the option for hours if the max runtime is 30 minutes. More recently, they added the ability to loop your camera moves so that you could hopefully have it sliding back and forth. Maybe you're using it for an interview or something like that. But wow, has it been so unreliable for me. On some occasions, I'll set it to do the loop and it'll go all the way out and it'll go all the way back and then it'll just stop and not continue moving. And other occasions, I've had it go all the way out and then zoom back to the beginning to repeat the motion again, which is completely different than the other option. And not to mention that this looping feature seemingly doesn't work when you are connected to the gimbal and the slider monopod slypod. There it is. Every time I leave the app, it disconnects me from the gimbal and the slypod. Even if I'm just checking a text message that came in, it disconnects. And if it disconnects, I have to reconnect them and restart all over again, manually putting in my in points and my out points. And this is what I'm talking about. It is just not a reliable tool when it comes to getting shots easily. Now, the track recording setting is also very frustrating for a few reasons. For one, you have this point on a little XY graph, and if I try and slide this around, it's hypersensitive. So trying to dial in an exact composition is really difficult.
I'm barely moving my finger. Like just barely moving my finger. And that's the kind of movement we're getting.
Thankfully, at the bottom of the app here, we have tilt and pan, and there's usually roll, but for some reason that's not there right now. But if you click them, you get a slider along the bottom. Now, I can't touch that slider because I'm on a modern phone that doesn't have a home button. There are, however, plus and minus buttons. They're so needlessly precise that if you miss by like a single pixel, then it doesn't move. And so you're trying to micro move it and you're looking at the device to see if it's moving. And then you're like, oh, my finger shifted a millimeter. So it's just so bad. It is a terribly designed app. One thing I forgot to mention that's very frustrating about the motion control setup is that when you're setting the in point for the gimbal, the slypod will always just stay at whatever its final destination is. So you always have to switch back to the slypod and say it's ending at the beginning of the move so that when you switch back to the gimbal, you can see what the composition will actually be. And then when you go to your next point, maybe it's your final destination or somewhere along the way, then you go back to the slypod, switch it to the end or the middle, wherever the next gimbal point will be, and pretend that's the end, and etc., etc. I don't understand why it doesn't just go to where it will be at that point in the move, but that's just another reason this app is trash. What I would love more than anything is for Moza to put out like a Slypod Pro Plus Max that has the gimbal built in or something like that. And it gives you the ability to just like physically move the camera and set point A, and then physically move the camera, select point B, and then from there you could choose how long does it take to go from A to B, what type of ease is there for takeoff and landing, how long does that ease take. But as it stands right now, I just absolutely could not recommend buying the Aircross 2 and the Slypod specifically for motion control type shots. And even while just doing my test shoots for the intro of this video, even though I would have my A points and my B points set up where I wanted, every time it would reset, the gimbal would drift. And because I was on that little XY graph, I kept having to compensate. So I'm like, pan a little more, pan a little more, pan a little more. Every time it would drift. So much so that I was eventually at the end of the graph and I could no longer correct for it to put me in the frame anymore. It was just useless. I think it's possible that maybe my specific version is kind of buggy and maybe other people aren't having these same phone connection issues. However, the app is still just convoluted, it's buggy, and it uses words that make no sense and give no explanation for what they do. So if Moza could remake this app from scratch to be much more intuitive, I would be so happy about that because I'd be able to get shots like that intro easier. But instead, it took me nearly 2 full days to set up a shot that just goes out and pans up. Having said all that, if I were to go back in time, I'd still probably back it on Kickstarter. It has come in surprisingly handy dozens of times for myself. I just wish it was so much more reliable because I would feel so bad if someone watched this video and they're like, oh, I want to do motion control, and they bring it out on their first big shoot and it fails and they're embarrassed by the client, and then the client screams at them and they start crying and they cry so much that they wet themselves. Do your own research. Don't buy it because you heard me be excited or saw some shots of mine that you liked. And don't not buy it just because I was like, the app kind of sucks. Like, there are use cases for it, and there are people that it would suit well for. The disconnect between the gimbal and the slypod and the app is just a little lot too much for me to actually recommend. So, thanks, Moza.